landlord-tenant relationships can be tricky. Janke Strydom, Associate of Real Estate at Cliffe, Dekker, Hofmeyr, and Michelle Dickens, MD of TPN, join us now in the studio. Michelle, I suppose there's inevitably going to be tension between landlords and tenants. I don't know if there are particular issues at the moment or if it's just an ongoing thing. Set out the problem for us.
So for years, since 1996, we've seen change in legislation as it regulates residential tenant-landlord relationships. And I think this is just an ongoing addition to that. What it does seek to do is protect tenants a little bit more. So there's been some changes in terms of putting in place written lease agreements. I think that protects both tenant and landlords, defining that the tenant needs, that the landlords need to maintain the property and what that maintenance requirement would be, and potentially looking at limiting deposits that are held in terms of the unfair practice regulations that need to be produced going forward, and maybe even limiting the escalations to rentals.
From your perspective, Janke, what are the issues and how big are these problems? Do they require a lot of attention?
There are obviously very big issues to deal with. For example, holding over tenants that doesn't pay their rent, and then the landlord elects to cancel the agreement, and then the tenant refuses to vacate the property. Then the landlord will obviously have to obtain an eviction order in terms of the Prevention of Illegal Eviction and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. From the tenant side, there are issues pertaining to the deposits, interest accrued on the deposit, at what stage will the deposit be refunded to the tenant, and whether he has a right to the interest that has accrued on such a deposit. Another issue that pops up quite often is what are the deductions that the landlord can make from the deposit and then thereafter to repay the deposit to the tenant. Can he, for example, claim for damages that has been caused to the property by the tenant, and so forth.
Janke, there's the Rental House Tribunal. What does that do? I mean, we've heard, is that a place where somebody goes to in order to sort out some of these landlord-tenant issues? Is that an avenue?
Yes, the Rental Housing Tribunal is a statutory creation. It's created in terms of the Rental Housing Act. It is, in essence, a forum where landlords and tenants can go with their disputes to have these type of disputes resolved, especially when it comes to unfair practices. Any issues relating to overcrowding, maintenance of the building, unfair rentals that have been levied, and so forth. The Rental Housing Tribunal is established by the MEC in the province, and it also is assisted by the Rental Housing Information Officers, where the tenants and the landlords can also go with their queries, and then the officers will take the information and then provide the information to the Rental Housing Tribunal to make a hearing on the matter.
Michelle, is the balance right? You know, one reads of people being in occupation and they can't be evicted, and that they have certain rights because they are resident, and then the landlord has the cost, he's not being paid, he's got to maintain the building, and he's got a deteriorating asset on his hand. On the other hand, you want to protect residents' rights. So is the balance right in South African law and practice?
I think the balance is changing, and more so in favour of the tenant. I think we have a huge shortage of housing problem in South Africa, specifically in rental as well. And a lot of that is falling on private landlords to accommodate the growing need for accommodation. It's not that landlords can't get an eviction. If the tenant has breached his agreement and is not paying rent, and the lease has been cancelled and the tenant refuses to vacate, at that point the landlord does have remedy through the courts. I think the concern from the landlords is that that is a costly remedy and it's a lengthy remedy, and that's where the frustration from the landlord comes in. This rental housing amendment bill doesn't seek to change that. So the Rental Housing Tribunal is not an avenue that the landlord can approach in order to obtain an eviction order. He's still going to have to go through either the Magistrates Court or the High Court for that process.
One thinks of ombudsmen in various sectors to try and cut out the legal process, so you don't have to litigate and spend tens of thousands of rand with you, the lawyers. Is this process simple, or do we have this vast bureaucracy that it's actually not worth taking action?
Well, I agree with Michelle that when it comes to obtaining an eviction order, there's no other avenue other than by way of a court. It is also enshrined in the Constitution. So Section 26(3) of the Constitution states that no one may be evicted from their home or have their home demolished without an order of court. And the court will obviously consider all the relevant circumstances. In some instances, the court may even elect to suspend the operation of the eviction order until such time that the local authorities can provide alternative housing, not necessarily permanent housing, but temporary housing for those who will be evicted from buildings. But the Rental Housing Tribunal does make provision for a mediation process. If the dispute is of such a nature that it can be mediated, it will refer the dispute to a mediator for resolution. Alternatively, if it cannot be resolved with mediation, then the Rental Housing Tribunal will call a hearing and have all the evidence before it, and thereafter make a ruling.
Janke, this sounds so complicated. And I'm thinking, perhaps isn't there a way to make things easier? Is there no system somewhere where somebody can merely put in a tenant's details to do a check to see how they've performed, or whether or not they've been able to pay their rent on time with previous landlords? Is there
well, that's
something
what
like
you
that?
do, don't you?
Yes, there must be something.
That's exactly what we do, and this is exactly the point of finding a quality tenant up front and limiting the chance of ending up with a delinquent tenant and in the courts and in the tribunals. And I must point out that 86% of tenants are in good standing. They are paying their rent, they are maintaining the property. It's only a small portion of tenants, 6% that aren't paying, but even a smaller portion that squat in the property. So only 2% of tenants are tenants that will sit in the property and wait for you to obtain the court order to get them out. Doing that check up front and placing that quality tenant up front is going to limit your risk as a landlord.
That sounds like the most sensible course, rather than be landed with a problem. Thanks to Janke Strydom, who's Associate of Real Estate at Cliffe, Dekker, Hofmeyr, and Michelle Dickens, she's MD of TPN.